Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I gave a lecture yesterday. I'll be chairing a session this afternoon and doing an industry-sponsored session. But what this is the nicest about is that we're understanding that hemodynamics, when assessed using monitoring, can be used to diagnose and treat critical illness. But to do that, you actually have to understand what you're looking at. And so I was tasked with talking about the arterial pressure. And I must admit that it was a little bit interesting for me to develop this because my very, very good friend Jean-Louis Touboul gives this lecture all the time. And so I shamelessly took his approach, but I put my own data in it to show what is happening. This is the arterial pressure waveform. And this person, let's say, has a blood pressure, a diastolic of approximately 80, and a systolic of about 120 millimeters of mercury. But as you can see, the actual arterial pressure is not constant, but highly variable during both systole, the dicrotic notch, and diastole. And all parts of this are important. We can discuss the systolic arterial pressure or the diastolic arterial pressure. Most people, when they think about organ perfusion, want to know the mean arterial pressure. And then something that we've had a lot of interest in is the pulse pressure. And so let's describe those. If we just look at the systolic arterial pressure, it's determined by stroke volume, primarily, and the ejection velocity, how fast the blood goes out, and the arterial stiffness. For the same stroke volume and arterial stiffness, if contractility is impaired, the systolic pressure goes down because the blood is being pumped into a stiff vasculature, and if the rate of ejection is slow, the systolic blood pressure goes down. Systolic blood pressure is one of the major determinants of dissection of aortic aneurysms, hence the use of esmolol and other beta-blocking agents by decreasing the rate of ejection, decrease systolic blood pressure. How does the arterial pressure occur? Well, the body has a very high central capacitance in the aorta, from the thoracic and abdominal aorta down to the vessels. And during each systole, the central aortic compartment expands to increase the pressure, and that's the stroke volume, and then the blood flow goes out across the resistance. And if you were to look at the arterial pulse pressure, which is not flow, the arterial pulse pressure that is going out to the periphery, you would see that it would be uniform. However, it then impacts upon bifurcations and the periphery and develops reflected waves. And these reflected waves come back like this. And that results in a summation of the two. So in the periphery, the pulse pressure is actually higher and the systolic pressure is much higher. And since the waves are coming slightly later relative to the ejection, the actual shape of the arterial pulse pressure and systolic pressure becomes different depending on where you are in the arterial tree. And indeed, if you were to look at the real arterial pressure that'd be seen in the aorta, it would be shown by this dotted line here. This very small dotted line represents the reflected wave, and at least in the ascending aorta, we see this very complex value. As you go further and further down to the femoral artery, you see that the waves become summated and you have an increase in systolic arterial pressure. So if you ask me, what is the systolic arterial pressure of a patient, I will answer, it depends on where you measure it, not just on the stroke volume, elasticity, and contractility. As you can see, the further down you go, the higher the systolic pressure, and the longer it is before the dicrotic notch. Furthermore, with increasing stiffness, as you get older, you can see that the dicrotic notch is lost, even though the mean arterial pressure is absolutely the same. This is a study done by Dr. Milner many years ago in which he put a malar catheter at the aorta and then walked backward centimeters towards the periphery, 50, and looked at the same arterial pressure. So these are all lined up at the same point. And you can see that the arterial pressure significantly changes its shape as you go down the arterial tree. There is your systolic pressure, But I'm now going to show you the reflected waves that are going out in the periphery and bouncing back, and I'm only going to show you some of the major reflected waves. So here's your primary wave. It then comes back, goes down, and bounces back again. And thus, when you look at it, the arterial pressure waveform is not constant across the arterial tree. One can plot that in 3 dimensions, with this being the original arterial pressure and this being the pressure way out in the periphery, and you can see that it grows. Interestingly, with significant shock, and this is an animal model of hemorrhagic shock, you get an extreme dysfunction. We decided to look at this in greater detail, and in collaboration with Faraz Hatib and Yoss Johnson, we took a pig model in which we induced endotoxic shock. We measured radial artery flow and cardiac output, and we induced endotoxic shock, and then we had resuscitation. Proportional amount of flow to the radial artery and to the aorta were the same when we induced the shock. And as you can see, mean arterial pressure fell, but then we measured the pressure specifically in the aorta, femoral artery, and radial artery. And you can see that during resuscitation, the aortic pressure rises more than the femoral, than the radial. And otherwise, look at the systolic pressure. In you and I and in the pigs, the systolic pressure is higher in the radial artery and gets smaller as you go towards the periphery. But look at what happens in endotoxic shock when you have profound peripheral vasodilation. You totally reverse that. Your aortic pressure becomes higher and your radial artery systolic pressure falls. And you can actually see that in this picture. Here is the baseline. Aorta has a lower systolic pressure, radial higher, and in sepsis it's the other way around. So if you're measuring arterial pressure in your patient and you're using a radial arterial catheter to measure it, you'll be underestimating the systolic pressure that is seen in the aorta. And if that patient also has an aortic aneurysm, you'll be underestimating this wall stress on the heart. The reason that this occurs in sepsis is because if you were to calculate the impedance, the stiffness of the vasculature, you would see that the aorta actually becomes stiffer, and that's probably because arterial pressure falls, and the aorta gets a little bit of edema in this wall, whereas the periphery, known for the inducible nitric oxide synthetase, dilates up, whereas the resistance is the same. So the compliance becomes greater in the periphery. So this dissociation between pressure and flow occurs in sepsis. So if you're measuring systolic arterial pressure, it may change in the opposite direction to mean arterial pressure in septic patients because of these regional changes in compliance. Enough about systolic arterial pressure. What about diastolic arterial pressure? Well, diastolic arterial pressure is determined by the cardiac output, arterial resistance, and blood viscosity. Importantly, in the heart rate. Importantly, it is the major driving pressure on the inside to determine coronary blood flow to the heart against CVP. As you can see, arterial resistance is not uniform across the arterial tree. As you look at the arterial pulse pressure, as you go from the aorta down to the radial arteries, you can see that in fact the mean arterial pressure remains constant as the systolic pressure rises. Those are the reflected waves, remember? But there is no arterial resistance. There is no arterial resistance. If there was, I couldn't measure mean arterial pressure with a radial artery catheter. It would be lower than aortic pressure, and they're the same. And the reason they are is because there's almost no blood flow between the aorta and the radial artery. This may sound strange, but let's think about it for a second. What is the normal stroke volume of a normal human being? 70, 100 mLs? Is that reasonable? Yes? Okay. How much volume is 100 mLs? It won't even fill the first part of the thoracic aortic arch. So every time you have a stroke volume, you're only recharging the capacitor. The amount of flow through the individual vessels is remarkably low. And most of the things that the large arteries do is they're capacitors. If you were to put a flow probe on a femoral artery of a human being as they're lying down relaxing, you would see during diastole, the flow was coming in the other direction towards the heart, because all you've done is charge the capacitor, and the flow then goes into the metabolically active tissues, the kidney, the gut, the brain, and the heart. So we have this central capacitor, but then we have a very high peripheral resistance, and this resistance is the determinant of diastolic pressure. Arterial resistance is not uniform. So if you were to have a prolonged diastole by giving acetylcholine or something like that, you would see that the pressure would fall down to some value. And if you've ever seen a patient with severe congestive heart failure with an arterial catheter in, you'll see that after systole, diastolic pressure remains very constant because the periphery is totally clamped down. So, diastolic pressure is a fundamental determinant of resistance, but it's linked to heart rate. And this is an idea that is based in physiology, but has been promoted very strongly by our co-chairman, Dr. Jean-Louis Thibault. So I have two patients here. Patient one has a heart rate of 90 and a blood pressure of 90/40, and patient two has a heart rate of 120 and a blood pressure of 90/40. Who is sicker? Two. Why? Well, if you look at the first one, this is their diastolic pressure. But if I have a rapid heart rate, I don't have enough time for the diastolic pressure to fall, so they're actually more vasodilated, but I've had a heartbeat. And in fact, if you'd allow the heart rate to have been the same as it was in the other patient, their diastolic pressure may have been 25. So tachycardia is the primary response of the body to loss of tone as a way of maintaining diastolic pressure. Does that make sense? That's why tachycardia is a sign of stress. Okay, what about mean arterial pressure? Mean arterial pressure is constant across the vasculature because there is essentially no central arterial resistance. The determinants of mean arterial pressure are cardiac output, the arterial resistance from the periphery, and now I'm talking arteriolar resistance, the resistance way out in the periphery. It's influenced by the vascular stiffness and by the input pressure, and it is also the input pressure for most tissues other than the heart. So, in collaboration with Jose Marquez, we went into the operating room, we put flow probes on human beings, and we measured aortic flow using the gold standard aortic flow probe against arterial pulse pressure. And what we showed was that in fact stroke volume and pulse pressure are tightly linked. However, there is a zero flow intercept point, which means that the back pressure to flow is significantly higher than CVP. So if I were to look at the pressure-flow relationship of the vasculature, and I have a very constricted system, I will need a high change in pressure for flow. If I have a very dilated system, I need a very low change in pressure for a very high increase in flow, right? Okay, so what the body does is for changes in arterial pressure, it auto-regulates the flow, such that as the pressure falls, blood flow to the organs remains constant. And it does it by, as the pressure falls, auto-regulating, progressively vasodilating the periphery. So mean arterial pressure in you and I is only important as a determinant of blood flow if you're below the level of autoregulation. Above the level of autoregulation, until you get to really big hypertensive values, it's not going to change blood flow distribution because the body autoregulates its resistance to maintain a constant flow. But when you get to the level of mean arterial pressure below this point, then your flow to your organs is pressure dependent, and we refer to that as circulatory shock. So the goal is to keep the mean arterial pressure above that value. Interestingly, in a fully dilated vascular bed, there is no vascular waterfall or resistance to flow. The downstream pressure really is tissue pressure or CVP because you're totally dilated, as it is in the coronaries under normal conditions. So you're actually in a true vascular waterfall where the only thing determining the pressure is the upstream pressure, minus the pressure here, because it doesn't matter how far it's going to go after that. What is the downstream pressure for organ perfusion? Well, for the brain, it's intracranial pressure. For the heart, it's diastolic minor CVP or intrathoracic pressure. For the kidney and the gut, CVP over intra-abdominal pressure. And for the skeleton, it's CVP over interstitial pressure. So mean arterial pressure is not the perfusion pressure of the organs. It is the input pressure against the back pressure that's determining perfusion. If you have patients with intra-abdominal hypertension, a mean intra-abdominal pressure of 15 millimeters of mercury, you have to subtract that from your mean arterial pressure to determine what your coronaries are really seeing. And thus, patients with pulmonary intra-abdominal hypertension can have ischemic kidneys with a mean arterial pressure of 70 because their back pressure is too high. Well, what is the proper pressure? I don't know. But in this study from Osvar and Jean-Louis Touboul's group, they targeted a high pressure of 80 to 85 versus a low pressure of 65 to 75. But I want you to note on this curve, 65 isn't even listed because the nurses thought that if 65 to 75 means 75. You know, if a little's good, more is better. But what they found was absolutely no difference in outcome of the two groups. But interestingly, in their sub-analysis, if they looked at people who had pre-existing hypertension, those patients benefited from being in the higher blood pressure group because they vasoconstricted and they needed less renal replacement therapy. And if you just had the 65 to 75 in that group, they didn't do well. Why don't we make everyone 80 to 85? Because there are more arrhythmias if you give vasopressors. And thus we can say that if you want to target a mean arterial pressure for organ perfusion, start at 65, 75 to 80 if you had previous hypertension, and then look at individual organs to determine their blood flow and try to measure the back pressure, whether that be CVP, intra-abdominal pressure, or intracranial pressure. Okay, now pulse pressure. Pulse pressure is determined by the stroke volume, and it's a primary determinant from one heartbeat to the next, but also central arterial elastance, and it's influenced by the stiffness of the vasculature, the blood viscosity. If you're anemic, you have a lower pulse pressure than if you have a high hemoglobin level for the same everything. So this is an example of different pulse pressures due to the fact that there's different times for diastolic filling. So if I change the heart rate, I'm going to change the pulse pressure. In you and in I, if I were to give you 2 liters of fluid over a half an hour and measure your cardiac output 15 minutes later, what will happen to it? Nothing. Your urine output will go up. But the determinants of cardiac output under normal conditions are not blood volume, but metabolic demand of the tissues. And thus, under normal conditions, fluids have no effect on the body other than the instantaneous change that occurs from giving it as a bolus. Okay? So when we're looking at pulse pressure then, if I simply take and give you a pacemaker and have your heart rate go from 80 to 120, your pulse pressure will go down. Your cardiac output won't increase by very much. Your stroke volume will simply go down because the determinants of cardiac output are not the heart, they're the body. So let us now take a look at how we can use the pressure waveform to understand more. So we got the pulse pressure, we've got all these other things. Can we put them together? Well, we can model from the flow in the aorta using the flow signal and resistance and capacitance, and we can actually generate from this the arterial pressure waveform. And you do that by looking at the resistance times compliance, and at 0, this is purely resistance. So at 0 frequency, this is resistance, but higher frequencies, it's impedance. So let me explain to you why this is important. What I plotted on this graph is the arterial pressure in this dotted line here and the aortic flow. Now, obviously, pressure is in millimeters of mercury and flow is in liters per minute, but if 100% of the determinants of arterial pressure was flow, these two curves should look the identical shape. Yeah? They're not. What we have is we have a part of our arterial pressure, which is totally independent of flow. And this is the fact that you're loading the capacitor of the arterial pressure and it's staying up. And note that most of it's occurring during diastole, which is when the arterial pressure stays up and maintains organ perfusion constantly. I can use this concept to calculate cardiac output. And the next speaker will go into the non-invasive and invasive ways of doing it. I'm just going to talk to you about the physics of defining it. If you looked at the diastolic area, and this dotted line was supposed to be down here, the actual area inside the systolic pressure pulse times the time for systole, the time over diastole, times a constant should equal stroke volume. And in 1947, Hamilton and Remington from Rochester, New York, showed in fact that stroke volume from the pulse contour technique accurately measured stroke volume measured indirectly and did pretty well, as you can see. The problem is that the diastolic pressure runoff often makes it not work well, and although the arterial pressure is pretty good, as you can see here, the pulse contour follows it, and numerous studies showed this long before there were any commercial companies showing it existed. But this is the problem. When they looked at the stroke volume measured with the arterial pressure technique on the y-axis versus the electromagnetic technique, it looked great during control conditions. But then when they added isoproterenol to change the periphery, the slope of the line changed. It was still linearly related, but the slope changed. That's the problem with using pulse contour devices. It assumes a constant compliance and resistance to the periphery to calculate stroke volume from the pulse pressure. And the one thing I can guarantee you in critically ill people is their compliance and resistance are not constant, but always changing. So one of the ways of getting around it is by asking what is the diastolic pressure decay, add that point to it, and it tends to get a little better. So remember I showed you our stroke volume versus arterial pulse pressure? As you can see, it intersects a point such that we have a slope. So I can define, for example, an arterial pulse pressure and a stroke volume, and if I increase the stroke volume, I'll increase the pulse pressure, and if I have no stroke volume, I'll have no pulse pressure. And the line that this defines is the arterial elastance. This is the beat-to-beat relationship between stroke volume and pulse pressure, and it's central arterial elastance. So if for the same stroke volume I have a lower pulse pressure, I must have a decreased central arterial elastance. And for the same stroke volume, if the pulse pressure rises, I must have an increase in central arterial elastance. And this is not physiology, this is physics. This is how we define things. So this has to be true. Now the determinants of this, as Maurizio Sassoni showed yesterday, if you saw it, may be confusing because when you look at pulse pressure variation and stroke volume variation, they're also going to be limited by contractility. So why do I care if I have a decreased elastance of my arterial tree? Well, let's assume I've got a person who's volume responsive. I can have a normal elastance here or a low elastance. If my elastance is low, even if I'm volume responsive, my blood pressure won't go up. And if my blood pressure doesn't go up, I'm not going to be perfusing the periphery. So in shock patients who are hypotensive, if they're volume responsive and you give them fluid, if they do not have an adequate pressure, they'll not do well. So what we did is we looked at the relationship between pulse pressure variation and stroke volume variation in a series of studies. I was not involved in this one. This is by Ignacio Amonge. And as you can see, in his septic shock volume responsive patients, he asked the question, would blood pressure go up when he gave fluid or not? And you can see that neither systemic vascular resistance, mean pulse pressure over mean stroke volume, which trauma surgeons call the shock index, or mean arterial pressure did not predict who would be blood pressure responsive. But the pulse pressure to stroke volume variation above 0.9 predicted who would be volume responsive. Maurizio Sassoni and his group in London said that this has nothing to do with positive pressure breathing. This is the periphery, and therefore this should also work in spontaneous patients because all we care about is the periphery. And they again showed that in fact that magic number of 0.9, if you're less than that, you're vasodilated and you need to get norepinephrine to raise blood pressure. And again, none of the others predicted it. And as you can see, with positive pressure breathing, you get a decrease in stroke volume, which causes a decrease in pulse pressure. And this instantaneous effect allows us to then look, using pulse pressure variation, at volume responsiveness. So if I have a good heart or a not so good heart, and both of them are breathing, I'm going to see pulse pressure variation, stroke volume variations. Eventually, the not so good heart's not going to be volume responsive, the good heart is. Finally, everyone's not volume responsive. And so with Jean-Louis Taboul and Frederick McCarr, we showed that in fact you could use this not systolic pressure, but the pulse pressure variation to determine volume responsiveness. And it's a dynamic effect that's seen during the breath. And the relationship between pulse pressure variation on the systolic arterial pressure to diastolic arterial pressure over the change in index predicted volume responsiveness. And that's the reason why now we can propose to you a precise, personalized resuscitation. The first thing you ask is your patient stable? If they are, have a nice day. If they're not, ask if they're volume responsive. The answer is either yes or no, a pulse pressure or stroke volume variation of greater than 10 to 15%. But you don't stop there. You say, is my patient volume responsive and have decreased vasomotor tone? The answer is yes or no. Half the patients will be volume responsive, half won't. If my patient is shocky, is volume responsive, is hypotensive, and has decreased vasomotor tone, yes, they need fluids, but they also need norepinephrine. However, if they are hypotensive but have normal tone, all they need is volume. Their blood pressure will go up. But in half the patients, they won't be volume responsive. If they have loss of vasomotor tone, they just need norepinephrine. Who is that? That's your fluid resuscitated patient in septic shock who's still hypotensive. But if they're hemodynamically unstable, not volume responsive, they may be hypotensive, but they're not having a decreased vasomotor tone. The problem is between my two hands. I don't know what it is, but it's right here. Tamponade, heart failure, arrhythmias. The person would be started on dobutamine as we're looking for the echo machine, and then you can reassess. So, arterial waveform analysis, systolic pressure tracks contractility, diastolic pressure tracks resistance, mean arterial pressure tracks organ perfusion, and pulse pressure tracks stroke volume. Waveform analysis is linked to arterial pressure and flow, and with that, I thank you for your attention.